May 27, 1943. Camp Crossville, Tennessee. The transport truck rolled to a stop outside the barbed wire gates, and Feldwebel Klaus Richter clutched the small wooden box against his chest with both hands, certain that within the next few minutes he would lose the only thing he had left from his previous life. Inside the box, wrapped in his spare undershirt, a small gray kitten mewed softly, terrified by the journey, the noise, the chaos of defeat and displacement. Klaus had found her 3 days earlier in the rubble of a bombed warehouse in Tunisia, a tiny creature, somehow still alive amid the death and destruction. He had named her Hoffnung, Hope. And now, as American guards approached to process the new arrivals, Klaus prepared himself for what he knew was coming. They would take her from him. They would destroy this small comfort, because that was what conquerors did. They broke you completely, left you with nothing, reminded you at every moment that you had lost everything, including the right to care about anything. He had been taught this his entire life. The weak deserved no mercy. The defeated deserved no kindness. He waited for the American sergeant to notice the box, to demand he open it, to laugh as he took away the last shred of humanity Klaus possessed. But what happened next would shatter everything Klaus Richter believed about his enemies, his country, and the world itself. The American sergeant, a stoppy man from somewhere in Pennsylvania, with gray at his temples and laugh lines around his eyes, approached Klaus with the standard processing paperwork. Name, rank, unit, date of capture. The questions came in heavily accented but comprehensible German. Klaus answered mechanically, his arms still wrapped around the wooden box, waiting for the inevitable moment. Then the kitten mewed again, louder this time, a tiny sound that nevertheless carried clearly in the afternoon air. The sergeant stopped mid-sentence. His eyes moved to the box. Klaus felt his stomach drop. Here it came, the cruelty he had been prepared for, the demonstration that defeated soldiers deserved nothing, not even the comfort of a small animal. But the sergeant didn't demand the box. Instead, his weathered face softened into something Klaus couldn't immediately identify. A smile. Not mocking or cruel, but gentle, almost amused. "You've got a cat in there?" the sergeant asked. Klaus nodded, unable to speak, every muscle tensed for the coming loss. The sergeant leaned closer, gestured toward the box. "Can I see?" Slowly, with trembling hands, Klaus lifted the lid. The gray kitten blinked up at them, tiny and vulnerable, her blue eyes wide with fear. The sergeant's smile broadened. He reached out one thick finger and gently stroked the kitten's head. She flinched, then leaned into the touch, purring despite her terror. "Pretty little thing," the sergeant said quietly. Then he looked up at Klaus, and what he said next would echo in Klaus's mind for the rest of his life. "You'll need to get her some proper food. We've got milk in the camp kitchen. Check with Corporal Henderson. He's a cat person." Klaus stared at the American, certain he had misunderstood. The sergeant couldn't possibly be telling him to keep the kitten. That would be against every rule of warfare, every principle of domination, every lesson Klaus had learned about what happened to the defeated. But the sergeant just made a note on his clipboard, nodded toward the camp gates, and said, "Welcome to Crossville, soldier. Try not to let that kitten wander outside the barracks at night. We've got some big raccoons around here that might not be friendly." Then he moved on to the next prisoner, leaving Klaus standing there with his wooden box and his kitten and his completely shattered understanding of reality. The story of Klaus Richter and his kitten would become legendary among German POWs in American camps, but it was far from unique. Across the United States, in over 500 camps housing more than 371,000 German prisoners, small acts of unexpected humanity were quietly demolishing the ideological foundations that Nazi propaganda had spent years constructing. And among these acts, perhaps none was more psychologically powerful than the American decision to allow prisoners to keep pets. The policy wasn't official. It appeared in no Geneva Convention guidelines, no military regulations, no formal directives from the Provost Marshal General's office. It existed instead in the discretionary space that American camp commanders and guards created through their own interpretation of what humane treatment meant. Some camps allowed it freely. Others permitted it with restrictions. A few prohibited it entirely. But the majority, reflecting a fundamental American pragmatism and informal kindness, simply let prisoners keep whatever animals they had adopted or found, as long as those animals didn't pose security risks or health hazards. To understand the psychological impact of this policy, one must first understand what German soldiers expected from captivity. The Nazi regime had spent years preparing its soldiers for the horrors of capture by enemy forces. The indoctrination was thorough, brutal, and designed to make surrender seem worse than death. Obergefreiter Martin Vogel, captured with the Afrika Korps in May 1943, would later write in his memoirs about the psychological preparation Wehrmacht soldiers received. We were shown propaganda films of Allied prisoner-of-war camps, British camps where German soldiers starved in muddy fields, Russian camps where prisoners froze to death or were worked to death in Siberian mines, and American camps, depicted as the worst of all, where Jewish guards supposedly tortured German prisoners, where racial inferiors were given power over their superiors, where men were broken systematically and deliberately. We were taught that capture meant death, and if not death, then degradation so complete that death would be preferable. These lessons shaped every Wehrmacht soldier's understanding of what awaited them if they surrendered. Capture meant losing not just freedom, but humanity itself. The enemy would strip away everything, reduce you to an object, remind you constantly that you had failed and therefore deserved only suffering. In this context, pets represented something profound. They were living connections to normal life, to the peacetime world of homes and families and simple affections. They were reminders that you were still human, still capable of caring for something vulnerable, still connected to the gentle rhythms of ordinary existence. Under Nazi ideology, such connections were simultaneously valued and controlled. The regime understood the psychological importance of pets and animals, which is why they featured so prominently in propaganda about wholesome German family life. Hitler's well-publicized affection for his dogs served this purpose. But the regime also understood that emotional connections not mediated by the state represented potential sources of independence.
For soldiers in the field, pets had been tolerated by the Wehrmacht as morale boosters, but always with the understanding that military necessity came first. Animals could be and were sacrificed without hesitation when circumstances demanded. The message was clear: nothing mattered except service to the Reich. All attachments were conditional, all affections subordinate to the demands of war. So when Klaus Richter arrived at Camp Crossville, expecting to have his kitten taken away, he wasn't being paranoid. He was applying the logic he had learned from his own military about how defeated enemies should be treated. In the Nazi worldview, allowing prisoners to keep pets would be seen as weakness, as sentimental foolishness that undermined the necessary harshness of military discipline. But the Americans operated from an entirely different understanding of what strength meant. The first night at Camp Crossville, Klaus lay on his bunk with Hoffnung curled against his chest, still unable to believe this was real. Around him in the barracks, other prisoners from his transport whispered their own stories of unexpected encounters with American attitudes toward animals. Gefreiter Hans Müller had been allowed to keep a small mongrel dog he'd found in North Africa, a scrappy terrier mix that had attached itself to his unit during the final desperate days of the Tunisian campaign. The dog, which Hans had named Rommel in darkly ironic tribute to their defeated commander, had been processed through intake just like a prisoner. An American veterinarian had examined him, traded him for fleas and dehydration, and issued him a tag number. The dog now wore this tag on a collar made by an American guard from spare boot leather. "They treated my dog better than I've been treated by some of my own officers," Hans whispered that night. The veterinarian, a captain, spent 20 minutes examining Rommel. He gave me instructions in German about feeding, about keeping him healthy. He was kind, not condescending, not mocking, just kind. As if it mattered to him that this dog was healthy. As if we were just two men discussing the care of a pet, not an enemy soldier and his captor. Unteroffizier Werner Schulz had witnessed an even more remarkable scene during processing. Another prisoner had been carrying a small bird in a makeshift cage, a canary that someone had kept as a mascot in the desert. The bird was in poor condition, its feathers dull, clearly malnourished. An American guard had noticed it and immediately called for the camp veterinarian. Werner watched as the American officer carefully examined the bird, then provided better housing, proper food, and detailed instructions to the prisoner on how to nurse the canary back to health. The American had spent 30 minutes on this task, treating it with the same seriousness he would give to any medical issue. "It was incomprehensible," Werner said. "We are prisoners, enemies. This bird is insignificant in the scope of global war, yet this American officer devoted his expertise and time to saving it. Not for propaganda purposes, not to demonstrate anything, simply because the bird needed help and he could provide it." These stories circulated through the barracks that first night, each one adding another crack to the ideological edifice Nazi propaganda had built in these men's minds. They had arrived expecting cruelty and found instead a casual kindness that treated their emotional needs as legitimate rather than as weakness. Corporal Henderson, the American soldier the sergeant had mentioned, found Klaus the next morning. He was a young man, perhaps 24, from somewhere in Ohio, with red hair and freckles and an easy smile. He carried a small bottle of milk and a shallow dish. "Heard you've got a kitten," Henderson said in English, gesturing for Klaus to follow him to a quiet corner of the compound. "Let's see what we're working with." Klaus opened the wooden box. Hoffnung peered out suspiciously at this new human. Henderson made soft clicking sounds with his tongue, the universal language of human to cat, and carefully reached in to lift the kitten out. He examined her with gentle expertise, checking her eyes, her ears, her tiny teeth. "She's maybe 6 weeks old," Henderson said, switching to halting German. "Too young to be away from her mother. She'll need milk for another week or two, then we can introduce solid food." He poured milk into the dish and placed it on the ground. Hoffnung approached cautiously, then began to lap at the milk with tiny pink tongue flicks. Henderson smiled, the expression transforming his young face into something boyish and warm. "I've got 3 cats back home in Cleveland. Miss 'em like crazy. Your little one here, she reminds me of Mittens. That's what we called her because she had white paws. Dumbest name in the world, but my little sister picked it when she was 5, so it stuck." He talked for several minutes about his cats, about his family, about the life he would return to when the war ended. Then he showed Klaus where to find water dishes, where the camp kept spare food that could be used for animals, which guards were sympathetic, and which were indifferent, but wouldn't interfere. "Some of the guys don't understand it," Henderson admitted. "They think letting you keep pets is going soft on the enemy. But the commander, he's got a different view. He says we're not fighting you. We're fighting what your government made you do. There's a difference. And if a cat or a dog helps you remember you're human, well, that serves our purposes too." This casual revelation, delivered while scratching Hoffnung behind her ears, contained a philosophical sophistication that Klaus found staggering. The Americans weren't being kind despite seeing the Germans as enemies. They were being kind because they distinguished between the men and the ideology that had sent them to war. This nuance, this refusal to reduce humans to simple categories of friend or enemy, represented a way of thinking Klaus had never encountered. As weeks passed, Klaus watched the American relationship with animals reveal deeper truths about American character and values. The camps weren't just allowing pets to exist, they were supporting them, caring for them, treating them as legitimate concerns worthy of attention and resources. Camp Crossville, like many American POW camps, had been built in just a few months on what had been farmland. The construction was efficient, the facilities functional, and the layout designed for both security and reasonable comfort. But what struck Klaus and other prisoners was the casualness with which Americans incorporated animal care into the camp infrastructure. There was a makeshift veterinary clinic staffed by American military vets who treated both the camp's working animals and the prisoners' pets. There was a small area designated for exercising dogs. There was even a volunteer system where prisoners could sign up to help care for animals, a job that carried no pay but was eagerly sought because it provided purpose and connection.
Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had been a teacher in Bavaria before the war, volunteered to help organize the animal care program. In letters to his wife that passed through censors, he described the experience with something approaching wonder. "Lotte, you would not believe what I witnessed today. An American sergeant brought his personal dog to the camp, a golden retriever named Buddy, to visit with the prisoners' pets. He said he thought the dogs would enjoy playing together. So, for 1 hour this afternoon, I watched German prisoners playing with their adopted dogs and an American guard's pet in the exercise yard, while the guard stood there smiling, occasionally throwing a stick for the dogs to chase. The absurdity of it struck me deeply. We are at war. These men are our captors, yet here we were, united in the simple pleasure of watching dogs play. What kind of people bring their personal pets to fraternize with enemy prisoners' animals?" The answer to Ernst's question revealed something fundamental about American culture that German prisoners struggled to comprehend. The Americans seemed to operate from an assumption that baseline human dignity included the right to companionship and affection, even for enemies, even during war. This wasn't weakness. It was confidence. The Americans were so secure in their power, so certain of their victory, that they could afford to be generous with small kindnesses. Klaus's kitten thrived. Within weeks, Hoffnung had grown from a tiny, terrified creature into a healthy young cat who ruled the barracks with imperious confidence. She slept on Klaus's bunk, hunted grasshoppers in the compound, and became something of a mascot for the German prisoners in his section. But more importantly, she became a bridge between Klaus and his American captors. Guards would stop to pet her, to ask how she was doing, to share stories of their own pets back home. These interactions, superficially about animals, created moments of genuine human connection that transcended the prisoner-guard dynamic. One guard, a corporal from Maine named O'Brien, brought Hoffnung a rubber ball from the camp store, purchased with his own money. "My cat back home loves these," he explained to Klaus. "Figured your little one might too." Klaus accepted the gift with stammering gratitude, struggling to reconcile this generosity with everything he had been taught about American character. In Nazi propaganda, Americans were portrayed as materialistic, selfish, concerned only with profit and personal gain. Yet here was a working-class American soldier spending his own limited money to buy a toy for an enemy prisoner's cat. The gift was small, the gesture simple, but its implications were profound. It suggested that Americans possessed an innate generosity that operated independently of national interest or ideology. They gave because giving was part of their cultural character, not because they expected anything in return. Summer 1943 brought an expansion of the pet program, if it could be called that. More prisoners arrived from the Tunisian campaign, many bringing animals they had adopted. The administration, rather than creating problems, simply adapted. Space was allocated for animal housing. Food supplies were adjusted to account for pets. The veterinary staff expanded their duties. Obergefreiter Paul Fischer arrived in July with a small desert fox he had somehow domesticated during the North Africa campaign. The fox, which Paul called Wüstenfox, desert fox, another ironic Rommel tribute, was wild and unpredictable. The American guards should have prohibited it as a security risk. Wild animals in a prison camp represented potential.
Instead, the camp veterinarian, Captain Morrison from Colorado, saw the fox as an interesting challenge. He worked with Paul over several weeks to assure the fox could be safely kept, that it received proper nutrition, that its housing met its needs. He consulted books and colleagues. He designed a specialized enclosure that allowed the fox to engage in natural behaviors while remaining secure. "Why do you do this?" Paul asked the captain during one of their consultations. "I am your enemy. This fox is just an animal. Why spend so much effort on something so insignificant?" Captain Morrison looked at Paul with genuine confusion, as if the question itself was strange. "Because the fox needs proper care," he said simply, "and because it clearly matters to you. That's reason enough." This American moral framework, where the mattering itself was sufficient justification for action, was alien to minds shaped by Nazi ideology. Under Nazism, everything had to serve some larger purpose. Individual desires, individual attachments, individual feelings only mattered if they contributed to collective goals. The idea that something could be worth doing simply because it mattered to one person, enemy or not, represented a radical individualism that German prisoners found simultaneously attractive and unsettling. By autumn 1943, Camp Crossville had become known among American POW facilities for its robust animal population. Dogs, cats, birds, even Paul's fox coexisted in a strange interspecies community that mirrored and mocked the human divisions of the war. The prisoners began constructing better housing for their pets, using scraps of wood and wire from camp workshops. The American guards not only permitted this, but assisted, providing tools and advice. Sergeant Miller, a carpenter from Oregon before the war, spent weekends helping prisoners build proper dog kennels and cat houses. "It's good woodworking practice," he told Klaus, when asked why he devoted his free time to this. "And besides, animals deserve decent shelter. Doesn't matter who owns them." This last statement, delivered casually while measuring boards, contained an implicit recognition of ownership rights that stunned Klaus. The Americans acknowledged that these pets belonged to the prisoners, that the Germans had legitimate possession of something even in captivity. This respect for personal property, even enemy personal property, contradicted everything Klaus had been taught about how conquest worked. The psychological transformation happening in Klaus and others wasn't dramatic or sudden. It came gradually, through accumulated small observations about American character and values. The pets served as daily reminders that their captors operated from fundamentally different assumptions about how to treat defeated enemies. In December 1943, winter arrived in Tennessee with unusual severity. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Snow fell heavily. The barracks were heated, but the animal shelters outside were not. Klaus worried constantly about Hoffnung, who had never experienced real cold. Without being asked, the camp administration moved all prisoner pets into covered, heated facilities for the winter. Guards constructed a makeshift animal shelter using materials from the camp warehouse. Prisoners were allowed to visit their pets daily to ensure they were comfortable. On Christmas Eve, Klaus sat in the animal shelter with Hoffnung curled in his lap, listening to the wind howl outside, and tried to process what he was experiencing. His country was losing the war. His family in Germany faced deprivation and danger. He was a prisoner thousands of miles from home. Yet here he sat, warm and fed, holding his healthy cat, protected by the very enemies he had been taught to hate and fear. The contradiction was unbearable. Either everything he had been told about America was a lie, or this experience was an elaborate deception. But as months passed,
as the small kindnesses accumulated, as the consistent, decent treatment continued without wavering, the possibility of deception faded. This was real. This was how Americans actually behaved, not just as propaganda, not just for show, but as their normal operating procedure. Feldfebel Josef Kramer, who had arrived at Camp Crossville in September with a small mongrel dog he had named Fritz, began keeping a detailed diary of his observations about American treatment of prisoners and their pets. His entries, discovered decades later in the National Archives, provide remarkable insight into the psychological transformation happening in the camps. October 15, 1943. Fritz was examined today by the American veterinarian. The man spent 20 minutes checking my dog's health, explaining in careful German what he was looking for and why. He found a minor infection in Fritz's ear and provided medication at no cost. I asked what I owed. He looked confused and said treating animals was part of his duty. I cannot reconcile this care for an enemy's pet with the propaganda we were fed about American brutality. November 22, 1943. The Guards organized a dog show today. A dog show in a prisoner of war camp. Prisoners paraded their dogs, and American Guards served as judges. The winner, a mongrel belonging to Gefreiter Bauer, received a bag of dog treats and a new collar. The absurdity would be comical if it weren't so profound. What kind of society has the confidence and resources to organize dog shows for enemy prisoners? December 31, 1943. As the year ends, I find myself forced to confront uncomfortable truths. The Americans have treated Fritz better than many German civilians treated their own pets in the final years before I was captured. They have shown more concern for the welfare of an enemy's dog than our government showed for its own people. I begin to understand that we were lied to about everything, not just about American weakness, but about the fundamental nature of strength itself. The Americans are strong enough to be kind. We were taught that kindness was weakness. Perhaps that is why we lost. This last entry captured the essence of the ideological transformation. The German prisoners were being forced to recognize that their understanding of strength, power, and superiority had been fundamentally flawed. Real strength, American strength, allowed for mercy, generosity, and kindness toward the defeated. It didn't require cruelty to prove itself. Spring 1944 brought expanded work programs as prisoner labor became crucial to American agriculture and industry. German POWs were deployed to farms, factories, and work sites across Tennessee and neighboring states. Many were allowed to bring their pets with them to work sites, a decision that seemed inexplicable to the prisoners but made practical sense to the Americans. Klaus was assigned to a farm outside Crossville owned by a family named Henderson. No relation to Corporal Henderson, though Klaus initially assumed there must be a connection. The Hendersons were in their 60s, their sons off fighting in Europe, their farm suffering from the labor shortage that affected all of American. Klaus arrived at the Henderson farm on a sunny April morning, accompanied by 2 other prisoners and an American guard. Hoffnung rode in his shirt, her gray head poking out to survey this new environment with feline suspicion. Mrs. Henderson, a sturdy woman with gray hair and warm eyes, noticed the cat immediately. "Well now," she said, approaching slowly so as not to startle the animal, "who do we have here?" Klaus explained in his improving English about finding Hoffnung in Tunisia, about the Americans allowing him to keep her, about how the cat had become his connection to normal life. Mrs. Henderson listened with attention, then smiled. "She can stay in the barn while you work. We've got plenty of mice that need catching. She'll earn her keep." Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "My old tomcat, Chester, passed last winter.
It'll be nice having a cat around the place again. This casual acceptance, this assumption that, of course, Klaus would want his cat with him, this naturalness about incorporating an enemy prisoner's pet into her farm routine, exemplified the American approach that had been dismantling Nazi ideology piece by piece in Klaus's mind. Over the following months, working at the Henderson farm, Klaus experienced American rural life in a way that completed his ideological transformation. The Hendersons treated him not as an enemy, but as a worker, and beyond that, almost as a guest. Mrs. Henderson packed lunches that exceeded what many German civilians were eating. Mr. Henderson taught him American farming techniques with patient expertise. They asked about his family in Germany with genuine concern. They shared stories about their sons in the military without anger or blame toward Klaus personally. And they doted on Hoffnung. Mrs. Henderson saved table scraps for the cat. Mr. Henderson built her a proper shelter in the barn. They laughed with delight when Hoffnung caught her first mouse. They included her in their household routines as if it was the most natural thing in the world to care for an enemy prisoner's cat. "We're not angry at you," Mrs. Henderson told Klaus one day during lunch break. "We're angry at Hitler. We're angry at the people who started this war. But you're just a young man who got caught up in something terrible, same as our boys. And that cat of yours, well, she didn't start any wars either. She's just a cat who needs looking after." This distinction, the same one Corporal Henderson had articulated months earlier, between the German people and the Nazi regime, represented a sophistication of moral thinking that Klaus had never encountered. It required holding multiple truths simultaneously: that Germany was the enemy, that German soldiers had done terrible things, but that individual Germans could still be recognized as humans capable of change and deserving of basic dignity. By summer 1944, as Allied forces stormed Normandy and began the liberation of Europe, the German prisoners at Camp Crossville had developed a community that included their pets as central elements. The animals had become more than mascots or companions. They were symbols of the unexpected humanity the prisoners had found in captivity, living proof that their enemies possessed moral qualities Nazi propaganda had insisted didn't exist. When news of the death camps reached the camps, when prisoners were forced to confront the Holocaust's reality, many found themselves turning to their pets for comfort as they processed the devastating truth about what their country had done. The Americans, with characteristic pragmatism, recognized this need and actually encouraged prisoners to spend time with their animals during this traumatic period. Klaus sat in the barn at the Henderson farm, holding Hoffnung and weeping when he first saw photographs from Buchenwald. Mr. Henderson found him there and said nothing, just sat beside him for a long while before finally speaking. "My wife and we've been talking. After the war, when you go home, things are going to be hard in Germany for a long time. If you need a place, if you want to come back to America, we'd sponsor you. We'd help you get started. You're a good worker, a good man. What your government did, that's not on you. You get to decide who you become after."
The offer was astonishing, almost incomprehensible. These Americans, whose sons were fighting against Germany, whose country was at war with Klaus's homeland, were offering to help him immigrate after the war. They were looking past nationality, past enmity, past everything that divided them, and seeing only a young man who would need help rebuilding his life. Klaus didn't accept the offer immediately. He needed to return to Germany, to find his family, to see what could be salvaged from the ruins. But the offer remained open, a standing invitation that symbolized American generosity and faith in human capacity for change. The end of the war in May 1945 brought complex emotions for the German prisoners: relief that the killing had stopped, anxiety about what they would find in Germany, guilt about what had been done in their names, and, strangely, sadness about leaving their American captivity. Klaus faced a particular dilemma. What would happen to Hoffnung? Could he take her back to Germany? Would she survive the journey? Would it be better to leave her here, where food was plentiful and veterinary care available? He discussed the problem with Corporal Henderson, who had become something of a friend over 2 years of captivity. The American listened carefully, then made a suggestion that perfectly captured the American approach to the entire prisoner experience. "Why don't you ask Mrs. Henderson on the farm if she'd take the cat?" he said. "That way, you'd know she's cared for. And who knows, maybe someday you'll come back to America and she'll still be there waiting." It was the perfect solution. The Hendersons agreed immediately, delighted to give Hoffnung a permanent home. Klaus said goodbye to his cat in the Henderson barn, holding her and explaining in German that she would be safe here, that these good people would care for her, that perhaps someday he would return. Hoffnung purred in his arms, unconcerned with geopolitics or human emotions, content in the moment as cats always are. The repatriation process began in late 1945. German prisoners were processed for return to a devastated homeland. Klaus was among the early groups scheduled to ship out in January 1946. Before he left, the American Guards and administration held a farewell gathering. It wasn't required, wasn't official, just something they wanted to do. They provided food, music, speeches about hoping for peace and friendship between nations. Guards who had watched over the prisoners for years shook hands, exchanged addresses, promised to stay in touch. Captain Morrison, the veterinarian, pulled Klaus aside and handed him a photograph. It showed Hoffnung, now a sleek adult cat, sitting in Mrs. Henderson's lap. "Thought you'd like to have this," Morrison said, "to remember that even in war, some good things." Klaus kept that photograph for the rest of his life. It became one of his most treasured possessions, not because it showed his cat, but because it symbolized what he had learned during his 2 years as an American prisoner: that strength could be gentle, that enemies could show kindness, that humanity could survive even the worst circumstances, that a society secure in its values could afford to treat the defeated with dignity. The ship carrying Klaus and thousands of other German prisoners departed New York Harbor in January 1946. As the Statue of Liberty receded into the distance, Klaus thought about everything he had experienced in America. The abundance that had shocked him, the industrial might that had awed him, the democratic principles that had challenged him. But more than any of that, he thought about the simple fact that Americans had let him keep his cat. That single small mercy, repeated in hundreds of camps with thousands of prisoners and their adopted pets, had accomplished what propaganda never could. It had shown defeated German soldiers that their enemies possessed a humanity that transcended ideology, that American values weren't just slogans, but lived realities, that a free society created people who were confident enough in their strength to be kind to the powerless. Klaus returned to a Germany that barely existed. His hometown of Kassel had been bombed into rubble. His family's home was gone. His parents had died in an air raid. His brother was missing in Russia. The country he had fought for lay in ruins, divided among the victors, stripped of illusions and pride. But Klaus carried with him something valuable: knowledge that reconstruction was possible, that democracies created prosperity, that former enemies could become friends.
He had seen it work in miniature in the American prison camps, where defeated soldiers had been treated with dignity and helped to remember their humanity. He worked through the rubble years of the late 1940s, rebuilding in small ways, surviving on American aid packages and hope. He taught English, translating his language skills into modest income. He helped organize democratic meetings in his community, applying lessons learned from watching American camp councils operate. And in 1952, when Germany had stabilized enough that he could think about more than mere survival, Klaus wrote to the Hendersons. The letter took weeks to arrive, but the response came quickly. Hoffmann was well, now a dignified older cat who ruled the Henderson household with benevolent tyranny. The Hendersons renewed their offer. Would Klaus like to come to America? This time, Klaus accepted. He immigrated in 1953, sponsored by the Henderson family, carrying little more than his clothes and that photograph of his cat. He worked on the Henderson farm for 2 years, saving money and learning American ways. He eventually moved to Cleveland, where Corporal Henderson helped him find work in a factory. He became an American citizen in 1958. And yes, he was reunited with Hoffning, now an elderly cat, but still recognizable, still carrying that same imperious confidence. She lived 3 more years, spending her final days on Klaus's lap in his small Cleveland apartment, purring contentedly, as if the intervening years and miles had.
Klaus never forgot what that cat had taught him about American character. In the 1970s and 80s, he gave talks at schools and community centers about his experience as a German POW in America. He always told the story of being allowed to keep Hoffnung, of the kindness shown by American guards, of the Hendersons' generosity. People think big things change minds, he would say. Speeches, propaganda, grand gestures. But what changed me was small. It was being allowed to keep a kitten. It was an American soldier buying a toy for my cat. It was a farm family treating my pet like she mattered. These small mercies revealed more about American character than any propaganda could. They showed me that strength and kindness aren't opposites, that victors can afford generosity, that enemies can become friends if you treat them like humans first and enemies second. Klaus died in 1994, a naturalized American citizen who had built a good life in the country he had once been taught to hate. His obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer mentioned his service in the German army, his capture, his immigration, and his work teaching German-American understanding. But to those who knew him best, Klaus's most important story was always about a kitten named Hoffnung and the Americans who let him keep her. The broader story of German POWs and their pets in American camps never became famous. It appeared in no major histories, generated no headlines, created no policy debates. It was too small, too personal, too insignificant in the context of global war to merit much attention. But for the thousands of German prisoners who experienced it, for the American guards and administrators who permitted it, for the farm families and townspeople who accepted it, this small policy of allowing defeated enemies to maintain bonds with their pets represented something profound about American character. It demonstrated that American strength came not from cruelty, but from confidence. That American values weren't abandoned during war, but applied even to enemies. That American democracy produced a culture that recognized the importance of small human needs, even in the midst of massive military operations. The pets themselves, dogs and cats and birds, and even a few more exotic creatures, lived their animal lives unconcerned with the human ideologies and conflicts that swirled around them. They wanted food, shelter, affection, security.
simple needs that the Americans, despite being at war, despite facing enemies who had killed their countrymen, despite every reason to be harsh, chose to help meet. In doing so, the Americans accomplished what military force alone never could. They transformed enemies into friends, not through coercion, but through the quiet power of consistent decency. They proved that their way of life, their democratic values, their cultural assumption that individual dignity mattered, weren't just propaganda, but deeply embedded truths about how they actually operated in the world. The German POWs who were allowed to keep their pets learned this lesson viscerally through lived experience that no amount of propaganda could have created. They returned to Germany carrying this knowledge, and many, like Klaus, used it to help rebuild their country on better foundations.